I would say we can start with our very first talk for the semester in the seminar series. So first of all, welcome. Welcome to the Design++ seminar series in the spring semester 2025. My name is Andreas Müller. I'm one of the co-leads of the IDL, the Immersive Design Lab at Design++. Design++ itself is the Center for Augmented and Computational Design in Architecture, Engineering and Construction with, let's say, several goals on its agenda. One of the most important ones, and which is also the reason behind the seminar series, is from our point of view the knowledge transfer, which is also the fundamental idea of the facility here. In order to introduce new methods, to try out new methods, to change workflows, and also to, let's say, think or learn to think outside the box. So our first speaker is luckily more than suited for this mission. She's an architectural historian, an associate professor at ENSA Paris-Malaquais, and currently a senior researcher at the Gramazio Kohler Group. Her research sits at the intersection of architecture, sound technology, and media studies, exploring how sound and other media shape architectural experience. With her talk, Everything But Immersion on Sound and Other Media, she will give us the chance to dive into this interesting and very motivating and outside of the box, at least for a civil engineer, and give us a new perspective on different things. So with this said, please welcome with me, Dr. Carlotta Darò.
Thank you.
Thank you. The stage is yours.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Andreas, thank you, Fabio, and all the organizers of this seminar series for this invitation. It is the first time for me to confront an audience with, I think, in many cases, a much more accurate and empirical knowledge on immersive technologies, and to present initial hypotheses related on my ongoing research on the architecture of immersion and illusion that will occupy, I guess, my next few years. Obviously, given my background, I'm taking the topic from a very broad perspective and will be tackling mainly theoretical issues and historical facts. So I joined the Gramazio Kohler research through a convergence of interest in the field of architectural acoustics. My personal and previous work as historian on sensory and perceptual issues related to architectural design met the advanced research that the group was conducting through a series of applied projects. In particular, for the past 3 years, I've been observing the work conducted in the Immersive Design Studio. So for those who are not familiar with it, it's a classical architectural design studio, but students mainly rely on virtual and augmented reality technologies. And in parallel, together with ZHdK, we collaborated on a research project that has been recently approved by the SNF on what we call it Immersive Models, Acoustic Simulation in Architecture and Spatial Sound Arts. So even if the emphasis is put on acoustic simulations, it is, I think, evident that the notion of immersion comprehends a more totalizing frame related to the human experience. In today's cultural and artistic context, immersion is a ubiquitous notion, a trendy concept used in a multiplicity of situations to the point of causing a loss or an approximate use of its original meaning. 1991 Howard Reingold book on virtual reality contributed to a contemporary understanding of the notion of immersion linked to that of virtual reality systems that produce the illusion of being inside a computer-generated scene, allowing the user to navigate, manipulate, and transform that scene. Since then, the adjective immersive gained in popularity, creating a confusion of semantic level, becoming, in retrospect, a diachronic category of art, but also, as said, a synonym for precise contemporary technologies. In our current use, the adjective immersive can become synonymous with enveloping, intense, sensorially stimulating, very similar. These properties take on, I would say, a contemporary aesthetic value, sometimes replacing the classical category of beauty, of the sublime, the picturesque. Works of art, exhibitions, films, installations, architectural spaces are immersive when they imply a total sensorial and emotional involvement of the public, when they aim to offer an experience rather than a distant and intellectual enjoyment of the work. But this shift in the meaning of the original term of late Latin etymology from the first half of the 17th century, immergere, emergere, to dive, combined with the prefix in, is a recent phenomenon that has attracted the attention and critique of various authors. Conceptually inaccurate for the French philosopher Mathieu Triclot, who points out that the use of the original image of a body immersed in a liquid is actually a misleading metaphor when signifying the individual immersed in a work, because it alludes to a condition that rather generates a disturbance and the saturation of the natural perceptive capacity of the human being, rather than their provoked intensification. Theoretically redundant for Mark Wigley, who inscribes it in a history of museography traditionally already inspired by two main theoretical tendencies. So that of the period rooms, he calls it the immersive approach, so the reconstitution of immersive atmospheres. So this is the museums that organize their collection according to historical periods. Each period is in a room, and this room reconstitute a related atmosphere. As opposed to the white cube model, so the expression of a more scientific and discursive approach, Wigley calls it the discursive approach, to knowledge, where architecture is presumed to be more a neutral container, so hosting these individual objects that are displayed inside. Or as Will Shrimshaw explains, immersion as the new orthodoxy of sound art, based on a series of received ideas on a presumed condition of greater affectivity and perceptive completeness of the listening experience compared to the rationality of the visual experience, due to the spatial temporal immediacy of sound, which would differ from the various forms of epistemic abstraction and critical distance generally included in the act of seeing. Borrowing from Jonathan Stern's reading on the ideological predicament against the hegemony of the visual, the audiovisual litany, as he called it, lists a series of binary oppositions, often used by authors from sound and communication studies, to demonstrate an alleged underestimation of the auditory over the visual. Among the mentioned different categories, auditory immersion is opposed to visual perspective, based on the shared idea that hearing is a 360-degree physical experience surrounding the subject, while vision would only imply a frontal relationship to her or him. Even though this idea is a certainly simplified and somehow misleading assumption. Or for Peter Sloterdijk, immersion as an interpretative category of art, immersion as a method that frames images and vistas, dissolving the boundaries with the environment. He says, architecture, together with music, is considered the original form in which the immersion of humans in artificial environments has been developed into a culturally controlled process. The philosopher defines further architecture as an inherently form of totalitarianism, or rather the production of an environment into which its inhabitants submerge body and all. To use Gottfried Semper's beautiful expression, the haze of carnival candles is the true atmosphere of art. It is a sensuous appearance that should make us forget the means and the materials through which it appears, like technical apparatus in a set stage. It seems that the origin of the non-literal use of immersion as a total subjective implication dates back to the foundation of modern anthropology. In 1914, forced to be confined for 20 months on the island of Papua New Guinea due to the outbreak of the First World War, anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski introduced a new methodology of fieldwork based on participant observation, which meant that his engagement became a total experience, total immersion, living among a group of people, learning the language and participating in their daily activities for an extended period, in order to gain a more complete and intimate understanding of the lifestyle of the people he was studying. His initial forced confinement later became a voluntary method for scientific research. Curiously enough, the introduction of soundtracks in exhibitions and museums, a constant feature of what today we label, for instance, as an immersive exhibition, also finds its origin in social sciences, more precisely in natural history. During the late 19th century, the Sweden ornithologist, naturalist, and taxidermist Gustav Kolthoff started a new tradition of biological museums. Firstly, as curator of the Zoological Museum in the University of Uppsala, and in 1893, establishing Stockholm's first dedicated biological museum. With architect Agi Lindegren, he conceived a new building containing a large cylindrical hall, a continuous painted illusory scene in the background created by the painter Lindorm Ligeforth, stuffed animals, and a two-tier wooden platform in the middle to provide direct simulation experiences for the public. Through a complete scene, he says, the public can see immediately what words cannot say. Building a totalizing architectural device, Kolthoff artificially recreated 8 different Sweden habitats for temporary immersion. The diorama, literally seen through, is an invention generally attributed to Louis Daguerre, defining a theater space with a specific device, a half-transparent veil animated by light effects, a kind of proto-cinematographic theater far from the three-dimensional effects of animal scenes. However, the same date of its invention, in 1822, the American artist and naturalist Charles Willson Pale paints the artist in his museum, testifying an early use of taxidermy to create an overly symbolic scene. On the foreground of the painting, there are a dead wild turkey with Pale's taxidermic tools. On the up left, also a bald eagle, both animals embodying national symbols. And on the extreme left, a paddlefish from Allegheny River, reported by the naturalist as the first article of the collection. On the bottom right, the bones of a mastodon. Pale reconstructed the skeleton of a mastodon in 1800, and this became the main attraction of his museum, as you can see slightly on the background of the painting. On the middle ground, the full-length self-portrait of Pale himself invites the public to enter the museum, pulling back a draped crimson curtain like in a theatrical act. On the background, Pale's collection with thousands of specimens of birds and other animals, gathered through donations or hunting them himself. The museum's shelves display animal species classified according to the taxonomy principles of the time. Above them, portraits of revolutionary heroes and other notable Americans are displayed as part of a great chain of beings. In the background, 4 human figures, a differentiated public benefiting from the scientific achievements of natural history, particularly a child representing posterity, a drive towards the future. The animal scenes habitat dioramas created around 70 years later in the case of biological museums have brought further the theme of illusion as decor. They are pieces of environments that are not exhibitable in their fully constitution. They show their physical limits, their frame, like still life caskets extracted from the real world. As others have already pointed out, it is exactly this uncanny tension, defined by Ernst Jentsch in its Psychology of the Uncanny in 1906 as something that cannot be clearly classified by the human reason, generating a doubt, a quote, as to whether an apparently living being is animate, and conversely doubt as to whether a lifeless object may not, in fact, be animate. Science becomes a theater, a scene that defies rational thought by admitting the principle of the indistinction of true and false. And everything that could make that scene the most intense, immersive, was an additional value. To quote a contemporary account of dioramas, the French poet Charles Baudelaire put it this way: I want to be drawn back to the diorama whose brutal, enormous magic imposes a useful illusion on me. I prefer to contemplate a few theatrical sets where I find my most cherished dreams artistically expressed and tragically concentrated. These things, because they are false, are infinitely more real. The concept rapidly spread in Europe and subsequently in the US, following this tradition of uncanny experiences between objects and living beings, life and death, art and science, artifice and reality. Cornell University opened in 1936 a first exhibition featuring usual scene with stuffed animals, but also adding sound and moving pictures. This material had been collected by a team from Cornell University and the American Museum of Natural History a year earlier, even though the sounds were subsequently manipulated and adjusted to appear more realistic. This principle was definitively adopted in 1939 by the American Museum of Natural History in New York, which permanently added recorded sound to their exhibit halls as a way to relieve visitor fatigue vis-à-vis of the museum experience. Like the taxidermy on display, the sounds coming out of the speakers were then based on a series of scientific fictions, mixing authentic recordings with artfully recreated animal sounds. The veracity of facts was replaced by the verisimilitude of experience. Fictional animal sounds were already popular in the jungle adventure movies of the 30s, illustrating a general craze for exotism. The falsification of sound documents was a customary cinematographic practice named bruitage, from French bruit, noise, that was eventually criticized by scientists, but contributed to the entertainment and magic of the art of cinema. It's in this context that Michel Chillon theorizes the notion of syncrèse, a combination of synchronization and synthesis through associations that are instinctively created in the observing individual. It has been defined as, I quote, the irresistible spontaneous welding that occurs between a sound phenomenon and a punctual visual phenomenon when they fall at the same time, independently of any rational logic. Bruitage is thus a technique based on interpretation as opposed to factual description. With the development of mobile recording devices by Cornell and the American Museum of Natural History in the 20s and 30s, scientific conservation practices were able to include sound recordings as documentary material. However, this moved rapidly away from a purely imitative approach to nature and the goal of truthful reproduction, creating tapes that were hybrids between scientific conservation, education, and entertainment. An emblematic 1951 exhibition, The Men of Montagna, presented again at the American Museum of Natural History in New York and focusing on the ethnographic study of 8 tribes in Peruvian Amazonian, will call on sound engineer and discographer Moses Ash to prepare the soundtrack of the show. And I give you a little sample. this context, the sound sources for the tape were not taken from Peru, but from Panama, Connecticut, the Bronx Zoo, and the bathtub in Manhattan. The soundtrack is an example of nature faking that was appreciated both by the public and by museum professionals to the point that it was commercially released the following year, initiating a still-going Smithsonian collection of Folkways Science Series records. But let's now try to go back to architecture. We have been told that since the time of the codification of architectural practice through classical treatises, two notions significantly define the disciplinary foundation of the art of building. Mimesis. On the one side, architecture is described by many authors, from Vitruvius to Abel Augier, as the art of imitating nature. Thus, capitals simulated acanthus leaves and columns tree trunk, while the primitive hut has become the archetype of edification. Abstraction. On the other side, the figure of the architect is understood since the time of Renaissance, especially through the practice of Brunelleschi and Alberti's writing, as the professional figure capable of creating abstract representations of a project to come, using a notational vocabulary that extrapolates the significant information needed for the construction process through plans, sections, graphic or three-dimensional models. Immersive technologies blur these categories. At first glance, they aim to offer as much as possible realistic representation of a project, and beyond an abstract codified language, they seem to offer the experience to be inside that project. However, as Mario Carpo argues about the use of the perspective, virtual reality reproduces a system of coded writing, of bytes, of point in space, to create the illusion of something that is purely imagined, a pure product of our intellect based on our capacity to use representational schemata, abstractions, to understand the phenomenal world. If the notion of immersion is absent from any architectural treatise and theoretical literature until 1990s, that of illusion is explicitly addressed and seems to lie at the point of interference or friction between imitation and abstraction. A spokesman for neoclassicism and a defender of the value of imitating Greek art and the incorrupt principles of nature, as opposed, for instance, to the rational exuberance and artifice of Baroque art, Francesco Milizia surprisingly dedicates some interesting passages to the question of illusion, allowing us to come back, by contrast, to the question of realism or the faithful reproducibility of reality, all of which are commonly considered part of any kind of immersive experience. In his Dictionary of the Fine Arts of Drawing, published in 1797, Milizia states, "The arts of imitation have imitation as their object. They must imitate nature, but in such a way that it is recognized that they imitate. To imitate truths is not to make truths. If the orchestra imitated thunder in such a way that it sounded like a real thunder, everyone would feel astonishment instead of delight. If the painter depicted a lion as a real lion, everyone would run away. Imitation is never to arrive at the completed illusion." Echoing the principles underlying the cinematographic technique of bruitage, as well as the taxidermy mentioned earlier, Milizia goes on, his words seem to be a commentary on certain technical limitation that underlies the current state of immersive technologies. He says, "In some non-self-propelled things, such as a fruit, furniture, reliefs, architectural ornaments, the painter can bring imitation to the completed illusion. But in moving objects, and those of a vivid color, art cannot make this illusion. Much less can it do so things that are large and in great distance, because outside a single point of view, the viewer, who has to be led to that point, notices the deformity of art as it happens in perspectives." In virtual or augmented reality, anything that is moving and sounding, anything that overcomes a mastered scale of a scene can generate a disruption of the complete illusionary effect. However, breaking the illusion may also be a way to stimulate the human natural imaginative process. Human perception works together with brain capacity to imagine. As Triclot suggests, immersion is not about saturating human perceptual capacities, like an individual plunging into a liquid milieu where he or she cannot breathe, has trouble in distinctively hearing, speaking, and has viscous tactile sensations, but rather a calibrated system of stimuli combined with natural imagination. It is generally reported that when the Lumière brothers projected the arrival of a train at La Ciotat station in 1896, a 50-second fixed camera continuous shot, the spectators screamed and left to the back of the room. These 4 running silent movies was certainly a less immersive, less interactive, and less totalizing medium than nowadays so-called immersive media. However, it stimulated the audience's perception in an unprecedented way by evoking a possibly real situation while leaving a space for the audience's imagination. At a time when it was not yet possible to capture moving images, watching a film had a sensational effect, clearly depending on a common cultural background not yet used to it. Trusting in human capacity to develop his imagination in the face of representations that are not completely mimetic down to their minimal reduction as discussed in art criticism may represent an interesting, maybe less intuitive way of approaching the themes of perceptual illusion. And ultimately, this can bring us back to abstraction as a powerful tool for imagining architecture. Images are not things. We like images when they appear to be images, but we do not like them if they are taken for real things. And who could suffer the appearance of a massacre of a tiger if they appeared to us as real things, says again Francesco Milizia. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, Carlotta, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. So the next talks are basically all in May, as it seems. The upcoming talk is by Professor Dr. Michael Kraus on struct agents rethinking structural engineering paradigms in the age of agentic AI. So we are looking forward to the 8th of May. With this, no, not directly. If you miss some of the talks, of course, you always have the possibility to rewatch them through the YouTube channel. So, yeah, rewatch it if needed. With this said, enjoy the apéro, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.